This is the last footage of Sandra Birchmore alive. She is seen returning home to her apartment on February 1st, 2021, just before 6 p.m. Nothing out of the ordinary. 3 hours later, though, there's this. What is a Massachusetts law enforcement officer doing visiting Sandra's home? That evening, he came by her place at 9:30 p.m., and a half hour later, he left. That night, she took her own life. Or at least, that's what the initial report said.
At least 3 police officers in Stoughton had inappropriate sexual relations with a young woman.
One of those officers had known Birchmore since she was 13 years of age and began a relationship with her at age 15.
Yeah. And this story gets even darker. You guys, it's difficult to talk about topics like these, topics so vile, we can't even mention them by word on YouTube. But if there is any justice to be brought for Sandra, we need to spread her story, and we need to see what we can do so that such tragedies don't ever happen again. This is the infuriating story of Sandra Birchmore.
Cypress Police Explorer program is comprised of young adults between the ages of 14 and 20 who are interested in a potential career within the law enforcement field. The program works in conjunction with the Boy Scouts of America and creates a safe learning environment for the members to interact with others their age who have the same interests and goals.
Did you hear that? The Explorer program creates a safe learning environment and an opportunity for teens to meet other teens. Neither of these things was true for Sandra Birchmore. When she joined the Explorers program in Stoughton, Massachusetts, she was 13 and eager to meet other law-passionate teens. This was happening in 2010. Sandra was a good girl, that shy, kind girl that did not have a lot of friends at school, but was a really good friend when she chose to open up to someone. She also had some mental health issues and was seeing a therapist. Her mother thought it was a good idea if she found a passion and focused on it. So when Sandra expressed some interest in joining the Explorers program, her family encouraged her wholeheartedly. She would be in safe hands, right? Who better to trust than officers of the law, right?
Thank you for contributing to a healthy Stoughton, and we applaud your efforts.
This is Officer Robert Devine. In 2014, his account mass messaged his entire PD explicit photos of him and his mistress. Even some of the officers' spouses received these photos on their phones, though they did not work in the force. Everyone knew Robert's wife, Lisa, too. She worked at another station in a neighboring town. The information got to her really quick, and you can only imagine the attention that was on Robert that week at work. But he had a laid-back explanation. His mistress, Tiffany, was just a short fling, he said. When he had this revelation that he was married and he should end it, Tiffany decided to blackmail him by sending all of those photos from his account. He described her as crazy and put himself on a high horse, as if it was all right if it was just a short thing, and he eventually realized he was married. Wait a minute, had he ever forgotten? Tiffany's friends had another story to tell. It was not a short fling, and she was not obsessed with Robert like he told his workmates. She was also not the one who sent the photos. And when the scandal broke out, she had to change her name and start afresh in a new town. She had lost her job. It's honestly infuriating how women often get punished more than men for stories like these. Tiffany had to get out of town too. Robert used his power as an officer to convince everyone of his word over hers. Now, all the officers in that 30,000 people town hated her or saw her as a mentally unstable person. She could get in trouble over nothing. Robert, however, kept his job. Since it wasn't illegal, his bosses figured it was just an embarrassing blotch in the Stoughton PD's history. But some sources say this department had nothing but embarrassing stories.
The stories are like plot lines pulled from an over-the-top network crime drama. A police chief accused of trying to run down a lieutenant in the town hall parking lot. Illicit photos of a deputy chief and his mistress passed among officers and their spouses. A local official so unnerved at the state of his town that he felt compelled to carry a gun, not out of fear of any would-be criminal, but of the local police force itself. Over the past 2 decades, the 60-member Stoughton Police Department has been the epitome of dysfunction, besieged by scandals that have rocked this unassuming bedroom community south of Boston, but garnered little attention outside I-495. Despite its modest size, the agency has weathered state and federal criminal prosecutions, intense infighting that has led to several civil lawsuits, and an FBI probe into public corruption. The troubles are so entrenched that one former Stoughton police chief, upon taking the job, suggested publicly that some of his officers were mentally unfit to carry guns. I wouldn't want to get pulled over by these guys. guys, said Joseph Sicardo, who previously served as Stoughton's police chief in the mid-2000s. In a recent interview with the Globe, "It's incestuous down there. This is the worst of small-town governments."
Sheesh. And if an officer says this, you can only imagine how bad it really is. This is just to establish some context for the Explorers program and the world that Sandra stepped into when she was only 13. On February 4th, 2021, the Stoughton PD got a call about a missing person. A 23-year-old teacher's assistant named Sandra Birchmore had not turned up at school. She never did that, not without notifying her bosses first. She was a very hardworking woman, and she loved her job, as far as everyone knew. She would not just miss a day to slack off. Her work colleague who rang the authorities that day had something else to say. She had a serious reason to get worried about Sandra's disappearance. On her last day at school, she told her, "If anything happens to be, my boyfriend is responsible." It's unclear how their conversation ended that day. I, for one, would have a million questions about that statement, but perhaps Sandra did not want to delve super deep into it. Maybe she just wasn't ready to share everything. However, she wanted someone to know what she was going through. Now, all her colleagues had was this statement, and that alone should have been a good reason for the Stoughton PD to start their investigation ASAP. However, the officers were not that worried. You see, there had just been a 4-day Category 3 blizzard in Stoughton. This meant that school was closed until February 4th, and most people stayed home, as it was simply too dangerous to drive during such a violent blizzard. So the officers' first thought was, maybe she's snowed in somewhere, or maybe she thought that school was out for the day. But Sandra's colleague was adamant. She wanted a wellness check on her friend. So that day, 3 officers visited her apartment. When they knocked on her door, there was no answer. And when they checked the uncovered parking lot outside the building, they noticed Sandra's car was the only one covered in a ton of snow. The other residents had cleaned or used their cars already. This was the US. Sandra would have taken her car to leave the apartment any of the previous days. Since her car had clearly been unused since before the storm, the officers concluded she must be inside her apartment. So why was she not answering? When the officers entered her apartment, Sandra's 2 cats meowed desperately. They were starving, and their human mom lay dead on the bedroom floor. Her poor cats had watched her helplessly for 3 days, wondering if they would make it out alive too. Indeed, the coroner would conclude that Sandra had passed 3 days before, on February 1st. But that's not the only horror noted by the authorities. The officers wrote several disturbing clues about the tragic scene that they found that day. While Sandra's bathroom was clean and tidy, the bedroom and the living room were in deplorable states. There were papers, meds, and various objects lying everywhere. It looked like someone had ransacked the place looking for something. Considering how tidy the bathroom was, the officers concluded Sandra was not messy or a hoarder. Or even more disturbingly, after her death. There were no defensive marks on Sandra's body. She had taken her own life, the coroner concluded, by strangulation. She was 23 years old and she was pregnant. Needless to say, her poor baby did not make it either. This tragic case could have been closed right there and then if Sandra had done this to herself. There was no foul play, right? But even the officers, some of the officers, suspected something. So they checked the CCTV footage from her hallway. Here is Sandra on Monday, February 1st, getting delivery packages. Later on, she is seen leaving her apartment with a snow brush and a shovel. In other words, she was getting ready to clean her car and leave her house. That day, Sandra cleaned her car, but she never got to drive it into town. She returned to her apartment at 5:46 p.m. Some 4 hours later, a man twice her size, whose face is completely covered, visited her, as seen on her CCTV camera. He was in the building for 28 minutes. And around that time, Sandra went AWOL. Her text stopped that night, and she did not return any calls afterward. There's something else. Sandra passed with her neck tied with a scarf to her bedroom doorknob. This would have been almost impossible to go through with unless she was using some strong narcotics, the coroner noted. You'd have to fight your survival instincts hard to lay on the floor like that for several minutes. Except there were no drugs found in her system. Also, there were no notes. Sandra had family and friends. Why had she not announced her tragic decision to anyone in her inner circle? Her loved ones were devastated, and everyone had the same thing to say, this was not her. She was expecting a child and she was really happy about it. She'd even bought a baby chair just a few days prior from a local store. She would not have gone ahead and done this without talking to anyone about it. The forensic team took in Sandra's phone as evidence that day, and when the detectives went through it, they discovered ongoing conversations between her and 3 Stoughton officers: Robert Devine, yep, that guy, and twin brothers Matthew and William Farewell. Sandra had looked up to authority figures, especially officers of the law, since she was a little kid. Sandra had grown up with her mom Denise, her aunt, and her grandma. There were no father figures in the picture. To Sandra, the officers she met at the Explorers program were like the fathers she never had, but they did not see it the same way. The Explorers program is designed to last 10 weeks, but Sandra was there for 6 years, from 13 going on 14 to 20 years old. Look how small she was compared to the officers when she joined the program. And now just consider the fact that she was groomed for years, and her 2021 baby daddy was none other than Matthew Farewell. Pause and think about that for a second. You see, Sandra was not the only one to be drawn in seriously inappropriate scenarios by these vile cops. After her horrifying story made headlines, some other women in Stoughton came forward and said, hey, I was an explorer too, and this happened to me. Many women would testify to Stoughton officers inviting them into their cars, going to restaurants together, and adding them on Facebook. There was a big problem though. They were 13 when this was happening. A woman Jane told an even more terrifying story. She was 12 when she joined the Explorers program, as the age was lower back then, and she developed an instant crush on Robert Devine. This was not surprising, she said. Lots of girls gravitated around him. He acted like a high school jock or a slightly older kid rather than an adult officer. He was in his 30s when this was happening. When Jane handed him a love letter telling him how much she adored him and how she dreamed of them being together, Robert hugged her as if that was normal. And when she found out Robert was dating someone else, she threw a fit. Instead of confronting her about it and setting some boundaries, Robert invited her into an empty gym, grabbed her by the waist, put her on a table, and kissed her forehead. You're a total knockout, he said. I'm definitely taking you on a date when you turn 18. Except Robert was in his 30s and married, and Jane was 12. There are so many kinds of wrong here, I can't even begin to list them. It's safe to say that this guy is a monster and had been using his position of power to do horrible things to little girls. And what makes this case even more tragic is that in this story, there are 3 monsters, not 1. In 2016, when Sandra was 18, she lost her grandmother, mother, and aunt. First, her mother passed away after a long illness at age only 52. A month later, her heartbroken mother followed, Sandra's grandmother. Now Sandra had no immediate family. She was devastated and alone. Alone except for Robert, Matthew, and William. William was the first officer interviewed after the discovery of the many messages on Sandra's phone. He wasn't interrogated in a room. He was just asked a few questions inside a patrol car on a lunch break. William and his twin brother Matthew were 25 when Sandra was 13, and she joined the Explorers program. During his casual interrogation, William said something along the lines of, yeah, I knew Sandra, but I barely interacted with her back then. When questioned a little more, he said, okay, I actually introduced her to an army friend in 2018. And when questioned even more, he revealed he'd met her at restaurants during his work shifts. But that was not the issue. The issue was he'd had intimate relations with her. When detectives found kinky texts between the two and showed them to William, he said, yes, I admit, but that didn't happen until she was at least 20 years old. And just like Robert had done with Tiffany, he had the same theory. It was only a short fling. In the end, he realized he was married and cut ties with her. By the way, even if that was the case, does he not realize the impact he has on a young person by doing that? Sandra was a person with thoughts and feelings, and a vulnerable person who was struggling with mental health and had just lost her entire immediate family. The abuse of power is sickening, and you guys, it gets worse. William said he cut ties with Sandra in June 2020. Then he said he was actually intimate with her one last time in December 2020. Then detectives discovered he was in her flat in January 2021. And the other dude, the bulky one with the hood and the face mask, that was his twin brother, Matthew. You see, it's unclear who Sandra's baby daddy was. None of the twins would admit to it, but the paternity test would turn up their DNA. The problem with identical twins is it's almost impossible or extremely costly to determine which one of the twins is the dad. And Stoughton PD wasn't willing to put that much money into it. At this point, they were still questioning the twins about texting at work. That seemed to be more of a concern to them than Sandra's death. But there was so much more to it than that. And to end that topic, here's what Distractify had to say about William Farwell.
His twin brother, William Farwell, was also a police officer, and he later began engaging in sexual activity with Birchmore no later than April 2020. This involved sending sexually explicit texts and encouraging Birchmore to have sex with other police officers.
I am speechless. And did you note that also, indeed, the main case is about Matthew Farwell? You see, Matthew was 27 when he took Sandra's virginity. Sandra was 15. To say that's illegal is an understatement. When she joined the Explorers program, Sandra was a mentally vulnerable teen who needed guidance and support. She saw these men as father figures. She looked up to them and trusted them with her life. And what did they do with that? Today, it's believed that Matthew was Sandra's baby daddy. And on the day Sandra was last seen alive, Matthew's wife gave birth to their first child. So yeah, all of these monsters were grooming Sandra and cheating on their wives at the same time. Just let that sink in for a minute. When Matthew was interviewed, the detectives asked to search his phone. He said sure, but he deleted all his texts with Sandra. Of course, he should have known better. The detectives already had Sandra's phone searched, and they'd uncovered her conversation with Matthew. After all, it was the conversation that lasted a decade. Sandra was 13 when she met Matthew, and when his unspeakable grooming started. And she was 23 when she ended her life, or when her life was taken away from her. Matthew was also full of lies. Initially, he told detectives he'd only been intimate with Sandra a couple of times when he got intoxicated and Sandra was already 20. The same bogus story his twin brother had told the officers. And the more he was questioned, the more he added details. Okay, it was actually more than a couple of times. Okay, it started a little earlier, and it goes on like that. And guess what? Matthew also blamed Sandra's pregnancy on his twin brother. They both said the baby must be the other twins. It's honestly impossible to comprehend the lack of judgment, responsibility, and common sense in these men. They were not willing to take any responsibility, and they were not willing to care for that baby or for Sandra. She was a toy to them, and it gets even more sickening when you consider these guys were twins, and they were both with Sandra. And wait, it's not over. Matthew also blamed the victim, just like Robert, just like William. He said Sandra was a bit too obsessed with him. So on February 1st, that night he was seen on CCTV visiting Sandra, he broke up with her. Yep, that's his story. He broke up with her as she was a little too into him. So she decided to end her life even though she was carrying his baby. There are a million suspicious things about the Farwell twins, and yet, to this day, Sandra's death remains ruled as an S word. Here are a few clues to keep in mind. From 2017 to 2021, William ran 24 background searches on himself and Sandra in the criminal justice investigation system. That's an FBI criminal database, one of the most serious ones in the world. No one asked him to do this at work. Why would he look himself up? Did he expect to find a criminal investigation on himself any day? Also, Matthew visited her on February 1st during a Category 3 blizzard, hours before his wife gave birth. It seems like it was a top priority for him to see Sandra that night. I wonder why. And we haven't even spoke of Robert Devine yet, at least not in connection to Sandra.
When he first met 13-year-old Birchmore, Devine was in his late 30s. He too entered into a sexual relationship with Birchmore, though it didn't begin until she was in her early 20s. He denied doing so, but law enforcement found Facebook messages showing that while on duty, he discussed meeting Birchmore for sex. death, reported the Marshall Project.
So the Stoughton PD found out all of these things about these three men. Three men ganging up on a young, vulnerable girl, making her feel dependent on them, and then discarding her like trash. When she was found dead, all of them tried to dodge responsibility and blame the others for having more to do with her death. And they described Sandra as a simple fling that meant nothing to them. All of them were married. All of them were much older than Sandra, and all of them did something illegal. Well, several illegal things, from SA to grooming and to intimate relations with a student. And yet, there is no homicide investigation yet, even though the Stoughton PD has all of this in their record. Stoughton Chief Donna McNamara, the first woman to hold that position, was in charge of the investigation into Sandra's death.
All three men, the Farwells and Devine, violated their oath of office and should never have the privilege of serving any community as a police officer. They cultivated a web of deceit and treachery and violated the policies and the core values of the Stoughton Police Department.
She concluded, Matthew Farwell turned in his resignation from the Stoughton PD on April 1st, 2022. His brother and Robert Devine followed shortly after. They cannot return to the force, but they're not in prison either. In December 2022, Sandra's extended family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against all three men.
Birchmore's estate filed a wrongful death lawsuit against all three former officers, in which they accused the three men of and repeated sexual assaults from a young age. The lawsuit also names the town of Stoughton and the Stoughton PD as defendants, accusing them of negligent hiring, negligent supervision, and infliction of emotional distress. All named parties deny the allegations. According to the 14-page complaint filed in Norfolk Superior Court, Birchmore had endured significant mental and emotional problems from an early age, but she deeply respected authority figures, specifically police officers, and found a sense of belonging in the Youth Explorers program, which was run by Devine. The Farwell brothers, according to the complaint, were instructors in the program and Devine's protégés.
In May 2024, some new disgusting details came forward as the lawsuit is ongoing.
According to the Globe, which reviewed a tape from a November 2023 hearing in the wrongful death suit, a lawyer for Birchmore's estate said the three former police officers passed her around like she was a toy. At least two officers, they allege, had sex with Birchmore in patrol cars when she was an adult, and also encouraged her to engage in sexual acts with others. The agency has accused William Farwell of encouraging Birchmore to secretly record her sexual encounters and send him the photos or videos, including an August 2020 photo that Post has reviewed that depicted the male genitalia of an unnamed Stoughton officer.
It cannot get more sickening. And all of this is happening in Sandra's absence. She's not here to tell the full story. She can't speak for herself anymore. Only her family and the people on the good side of the law can help her have a voice now. There is a social media page called Justice for Sandra Birchmore. It has almost 5,000 members. Melissa Berry, who runs it, posted in February 2024 on the 3rd anniversary of Sandra's death.
3 years ago today, Sandra's body was found in her Canton apartment. She was found in a seated position with a ligature tied around her neck. It was fastened to her closet door handle. Her death was ruled suicide. Her death is what brought forth the abuse Sandra endured. Disgraced former Stoughton police officer Matthew Farwell was the last person to see Sandra alive. She was pregnant with his baby. Many believe Sandra didn't kill herself. She was looking forward to being a mother. Sandra Birchmore deserves a full investigation into her death.
There are still a lot of people fighting to see justice for Sandra and the three monsters that passed her around in prison for a long time. While there is no conclusion to her case, let's discuss one last thing. Grooming and abuse of power are serious issues that many young teens face today. These terms refer to the ways in which individuals, often in positions of authority, exploit their power to manipulate and control young people. It's crucial, you guys, to understand how these tactics work and what we can do to protect young teens from falling victim to such monsters. Grooming is a process used by predators to gain a young person's trust and manipulate them into a position of vulnerability. It often starts with the abuser appearing friendly, trustworthy, and caring. They might give gifts, offer special attention, or act as a mentor, aka Explorer program leader. The goal is to make the victim feel valued and dependent on the abuser. Grooming can happen in person or online. With the rise of social media, predators have found new ways to reach out to teens. They may pretend to be someone they're not or use fake profiles to build relationships with their targets. Abuse of power occurs when someone is in a position of authority, such as a teacher, coach, religious leader, officer of the law, or even a family member uses their influence to exploit or manipulate others. This abuse can take many forms, as you probably already know. People in power often have control over resources, opportunities, or privileges. When they abuse this power, they can pressure their victims into doing things they don't want to do by threatening to take away these resources or opportunities. Grooming and abuse of power are closely linked. Grooming is often the first step in abuse of power. Once a predator has established trust with their victim, they can begin to exploit that trust. Because the victim feels dependent on the abuser, they may be less likely to report the abuse or seek help. For example, a coach might groom a young athlete by giving them extra attention and praise. Once the athlete feels special and valued, the coach could start making inappropriate demands, threatening to cut the athlete from the team if they don't comply. It's important to recognize the signs of grooming and abuse of power. Here are some common red flags. Excessive attention. An adult giving a teen special treatment or gifts. Isolation. Encouraging the teen to spend time alone with them and away from friends and family. Secrets. Asking the teen to keep their relationship or certain activities a secret. Boundary violations. Inappropriate touching or comments that make the teen feel uncomfortable. Control. The adult controls aspects of the teen's life, such as who they can see or where they can go. Preventing grooming and abuse of power requires awareness and action from both teens and the adults around them. Here are some steps we can take. 1. Teach teens about the signs of grooming and abuse. Schools should include lessons on recognizing and responding to these behaviors. Parents can also talk to their children about healthy relationships and boundaries. 2. Encourage teens to talk about their experiences and feelings. Let them know it's okay to say no to an adult, even if that person is in a position of authority. Create a safe environment where they feel comfortable sharing their concerns. 3. If something feels off, it probably is. Encourage teens to trust their gut feelings. If an adult's behavior makes them uncomfortable, they should talk to a trusted adult about it. 4. Parents should keep an eye on their children's online interactions. Teach teens about the dangers of talking to strangers online and the importance of privacy settings on social media. Ensure that teens have a strong support network of friends, family, and mentors. Predators often target isolated teens, so being connected can be a protective factor. 6. If you notice an adult acting inappropriately towards a teen, report it to the proper authorities. Many organizations have policies and procedures in place to handle such reports. Stories like Sandra Birchmore's should never be in vain. Sandra did not die for nothing. If we can use her story to raise awareness and make sure such tragedies don't happen again, then her legacy of love and kindness survives. What she endured is unspeakable. Not one, but 3 P-words took advantage of her in the worst way possible. They did not prey on someone their size. They preyed on someone physically smaller, younger, and more vulnerable. They are the worst. While we wait for Sandra to get the justice she deserves, let us honor her by telling her story and keeping an eye out for any red flags. Let's keep each other safe. Thanks for watching, you guys. What are your thoughts on this case? And what can we do to prevent more young people like Sandra from falling into the claws of such monsters? Let me know in the comment section. And before you go, you know the drill. Like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. All right, see you soon.